The letter was still in his hand when his horse nearly threw him. Quinn Baxter had been riding for 3 hours straight through the dark heart of a New Mexico night, the paper crumpling against the reins. The words burned so deep into his memory that he no longer needed the moonlight to read them. He knew every sentence. He had read them 8 times before he ever climbed into the saddle, standing in the doorway of his office with the oil lamp guttering in the October wind, and his chest hollowed out like a canyon. She was leaving. Josephine Vance was leaving Red Creek, and she had not told him with her voice. She had not walked into his office and looked him in the eyes the way she always did, steady and unafraid, the way no woman in this territory had ever looked at him. She had written him a letter instead. 3 pages of her careful, slanted handwriting, the kind of letters that curled at the ends like she was trying to hold something back even in the script itself. He had not finished reading it before he was saddling his horse. The gelding, a sorrel named Colt, spooked now at a jackrabbit bursting out of the brush along the trail, rearing just enough to nearly unseat him. Quinn pulled hard on the reins and pressed his knees in, steadying the animal with a low, firm sound. And then he pushed forward faster than before because the fear that had taken up residence in his sternum would not let him slow down. She was heading for the stage stop at Millfield. That much the letter had said. She would take the morning stage north to Santa Fe, and from there she had connections, she had said. She had a cousin in Denver. She had a life that existed somewhere outside of this dusty, dangerous territory, where a woman like her had no business staying, and she had enumerated those reasons with such precision, and such quiet devastation that Quinn had felt each one like a physical blow. He did not blame her for leaving Red Creek. He blamed himself for every single reason she felt she had to. The night air was cold and tasted of sage and distant rain, and Quinn Baxter, Marshal of Red Creek County, rode through it like a man trying to outrun his own failures, the letter in his fist, his heart split clean open. 3 months earlier, on a Thursday afternoon in late July, Josephine Vance had stepped off the southbound stage from Albuquerque and into the most chaotic scene Red Creek had offered in 6 months. 2 cowboys from the Dalton spread had gotten into a disagreement over a card game that had moved from the saloon into the middle of Main Street, and Marshal Baxter had arrived just in time to find one of them bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow, and the other one sitting in the dirt, looking genuinely confused about how he had gotten there. Josephine had stepped around them with the particular composure of a woman who had learned very young that spectacle was best observed from a practical distance, and she had asked the first person she encountered, which happened to be Eugenia Marsh, who ran the dry goods store, whether there was a boarding house nearby, and whether it took in single women traveling alone. Eugenia, who noticed everything and forgot nothing, later told 3 separate people that the new woman in town was the kind of pretty that makes a man forget what he was saying, but the kind of smart that makes him wish he'd said something worth hearing. Josephine was 26 years old. With dark hair, she kept pinned at the base of her neck and brown eyes that were slightly too observant for most people's comfort. She had come to Red Creek for reasons she did not immediately share with anyone, which in a town of 400 souls was practically a declaration of war against the collective curiosity of its residents. She had taken a room at Clara Aldridge's boarding house on Elm Street, 2 blocks from the Marshal's office, and within her first week, she had presented herself to the office of the Red Creek Courier and asked the editor, a perpetually ink-stained man named Herbert Poole, whether he needed a correspondent. Herbert had looked at her over his spectacles and asked what she had written before. She had placed on his desk a copy of an article she had published in the Albuquerque Weekly Tribune on the subject of water rights disputes in the Rio Grande Valley, and Herbert had read the first 2 paragraphs and hired her on the spot. Quinn had met her on her 4th day in town. He was not a man who sought out social occasions. He was 32 years old, 6 feet even, with the kind of face that a charitable person would describe as weathered, and a less charitable one would call severe. He had held the Marshal's position in Red Creek for 4 years, having come to it by way of a deputy position in Tucson, and before that a period of his life that he did not discuss in any detail with anyone. He was respected, and somewhat feared and almost entirely alone by choice, because the work of keeping order in a territory like this one had a way of making intimacy feel like a liability. He had come into Herbert Poole's office to drop off the weekly notices, the wanted posters and public safety announcements that the Courier ran as a civic service, and he had found Josephine Vance sitting at the second desk, reading back her own copy, with her lips moving slightly, and her pen making small corrections in the margin. She had looked up at him without any of the wariness that most people directed at him automatically, and she had said, "You must be the Marshal. I was hoping to speak with you about the Patterson land dispute. I understand there was an incident last spring that the court records are vague about." Quinn had stood in the doorway holding his notices and had experienced the unusual sensation of not immediately knowing what to say. "The Patterson dispute was settled out of court," he said finally. "I know," she said. "That's why the court records are vague. I'm interested in what actually happened." He told her he had work to do. She told him she understood completely and asked if she could stop by the office later in the week. He said that was fine. She said she appreciated it. He left. He thought about the conversation 4 times before he reached his office. By the end of her first month in Red Creek, Josephine had written 3 articles for the Courier, 2 of which had been reprinted in the Albuquerque paper, had become a regular presence at the town council meetings, where she took notes with a ferocity that made several council members visibly nervous, and had established a habit of bringing a tin mug of coffee to the Marshal's office on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Quinn was not entirely sure how the coffee had started. He thought it might have begun as a way for her to ask him follow-up questions about the Patterson story, which she had eventually published to some controversy. And somehow the questions had become conversation, and the conversation had become something he looked forward to with an urgency that alarmed him the first time he recognized it for what it was. She asked him things that no one else in Red Creek asked. She asked what had brought him to Marshal work, not in the flattering, romantic way that townspeople sometimes asked, wanting to hear stories of heroism, but in the real way, the way that suggested she understood that most people's lives were shaped by necessity and accident as much as by intention. She asked what he thought the law owed to the people it governed versus what it simply imposed upon them. She asked whether he ever felt that the rules he enforced protected the people who already had power more than anyone else. He answered honestly, because she was the only person in 4 years who had asked honestly. He told her that the law in the territory was imperfect. He told her that he had seen it used as a weapon as often as a shield. He told her that he did his best to be something more precise than the law itself when the gap between the law and justice was wide enough to matter. She listened with her full attention, which was not something that happened to Quinn often, and she said, "I think that's the most important thing a person in your position can do. I also think it costs you something every time." He had not answered that. She had not pressed him. By August, he had begun to understand that he was in serious trouble. The nature of the trouble was not unusual in its outlines. He found reasons to walk past the Courier's office. He remembered specific things she had said during their conversations, and turned them over in his mind during the long, quiet night watches. He noticed when she was not in town, and the town felt differently shaped in her absence, as though a familiar landmark had been moved. What made it complicated was not the feeling itself, but the circumstances surrounding it, which were considerable, and which Quinn was aware of with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 4 years cataloging everything in his county that could go wrong. The first circumstance was a man named Denton Harlow. Denton Harlow had arrived in Red Creek 6 weeks after Josephine, which Quinn had not initially connected to anything until a conversation with his deputy, a 24-year-old named Samuel Reeves, who noticed social patterns the way Quinn noticed criminal ones. "That fellow Harlow asks about Miss Vance," Samuel had said one morning. "Not direct like, asks who she talks to, what she writes about, asked me if she'd interviewed you for any stories." Quinn had set down his coffee cup very carefully. "When was this?" "Yesterday, at the Silver Dollar." He made it seem casual, but it wasn't. Denton Harlow was supposedly a land speculator from Kansas City. He had money, visibly, and he spent it at the hotel rather than the boarding house, and he talked to people in the particular way of someone who was gathering information for purposes he kept private. Quinn had already been keeping a loose eye on him for the way he hovered around the town council members who dealt with land records. The knowledge that Harlow was also watching Josephine changed the texture of Quinn's concern significantly. He did not tell Josephine immediately. He wanted to understand what he was dealing with first, and he was aware, uncomfortably, that his hesitation was not entirely professional. There was a part of him that did not want to introduce danger into the space she occupied in his life, which was a foolish sentiment for a Marshal, and he knew it. The second circumstance was Josephine's actual reason for coming to Red Creek, which she told him on a Wednesday evening in late August, when they had fallen into the habit of walking along the creek path after she finished at the Courier on long deadline days. "My father owned land here," she said. "Or he was supposed to own it. He came out in 1879 with a land grant deed that he paid real money for in Santa Fe, and by 1881 he had lost it. The man who processed the original sale told him the deed was fraudulent, that he had been cheated. My father went back to Santa Fe to contest it and was told there was no record of the transaction." Quinn walked beside her in the cooling evening air and listened. "He died in 1884 believing that something had been stolen from him. I think he was right. I think the land grant deed was real and someone with connections in the land office destroyed the record of it. The land my father was supposed to own is now part of the Garrison Holdings parcel." Garrison Holdings was one of the largest landowners in the county. Quinn knew the name very well. "That's a serious allegation," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I need evidence before I write a word of it. That's what I've been looking for since I got here." He thought about Denton Harlow then, about the questions the man had been asking, and he said, "Josephine, I need to tell you something." He told her about Harlow. He watched her face go still and careful, the way it did when she was processing information she did not like. "You think he's connected to Garrison," she said. "I think it's possible. I don't have evidence either." She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I appreciate you telling me. I know you didn't have to. I'm the Marshal. Keeping people safe is my job." She looked at him sidelong with something complicated in her expression. "Is that the only reason you told me?" He did not answer immediately, and the pause said things that he was not yet ready to say directly, and she did not push him on it, and they walked back toward town, in a silence that had warmth in it rather than distance. What happened in the first week of September was what changed everything between them, though it did not resolve anything. It only deepened the stakes. Quinn had been following a thread of information about a series of fraudulent land documents that had been circulating in the county, and the thread had led him, through a source he trusted, to a name on a document that he had not expected to find. Garrison Holdings, with a secondary notation that matched the timeline of the Vance land grant precisely. He had gone to Josephine with this information because she had a right to it, and because he had come, over the preceding weeks, to trust her completely. He had spread the documents on the table in the boarding house parlor, which Clara Aldridge had given them use of after declaring the two of them the most obvious case of mutual obstinacy she had ever witnessed in 40 years of running a boarding house. And Josephine had bent over the table with her hair coming loose from its pins, and her finger tracing the dates and names with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting years for this. "This is it," she had said quietly. "This is what he lost. It's not proof of fraud on its own," Quinn said carefully, "but it's a foundation." She had looked up at him from across the table, and the lamplight had done something particular to her expression, something that stripped away the professional composure she wore like armor. And for a moment, she was simply a woman who had carried her father's grief for years and had just seen the first sign that it was grounded in something real. "Thank you," she said. Not the polite, public thank you that she deployed in professional contexts. The real one. He had stood on his side of the table and felt the thing between them clearly and completely, like recognizing a landmark in a landscape you have been navigating by instinct. "Josephine," he said. "Quinn," she said at the same moment. And then they both stopped. And then they both made some small, involuntary motion toward each other. And Clara Aldridge chose that precise moment to bring in a fresh pot of coffee, which she later described to Eugenia Marsh as the single greatest act of poor timing in her personal history. They did not speak of what had almost happened. They continued working. They made a plan for how Josephine would write the story and Quinn would pursue the legal documentation simultaneously, so that neither of them was acting alone. It was a practical plan. It was also a way of staying close to each other under circumstances that justified it, and they both knew that and neither of them said it. September progressed. The story grew more complex and more dangerous. Quinn began to understand that Denton Harlow was not merely a land speculator, but was actively employed by Garrison Holdings as an informal operative, gathering information and, when necessary, creating problems for people who were creating problems for Garrison. He had evidence of this that was suggestive but not conclusive, and he had sent a letter to the county sheriff asking for a consultation on the matter. He had also, in the evenings, walked with Josephine along the creek when they could manage it, and their conversations had become the kind that happen between people who are no longer performing anything, who are simply present with each other in the particular way that is more intimate than most physical contact. She told him about her childhood in Santa Fe, about her father's belief that the land in New Mexico Territory was going to be the foundation of something lasting for their family, about the particular quality of loss that comes not from death, but from seeing someone's hope destroyed. He told her things he had not told anyone in Red Creek. He told her about the years before he came to Marshal work, about the choices he had made that he was not proud of, about the reason he had pursued law enforcement with something close to penance. She listened without judgment and said, "The fact that those years made you into someone who uses the law as a shield instead of a sword tells me everything I need to know about who you are." He had looked at her in the September dusk and felt something enormous and terrifying, the kind of feeling that does not ask permission and does not wait until conditions are appropriate. "I don't want anything to happen to you," he said. It was not exactly what he meant, but it was what came out. "I know," she said. "I don't want anything to happen to you either. It was not a declaration. It was something quieter and more real than a declaration, and it stayed with him. In the second week of October, three things happened in rapid succession that broke the careful equilibrium they had been maintaining. The first was that Josephine received a direct warning. She found a note slipped under the door of her room at Clara's boarding house that said in plain printed letters, "Your interest in certain property matters would be best discontinued. A woman alone in this territory has few protections." Quinn saw the note and felt a cold, specific anger that he kept controlled by an act of will. The second was that Denton Harlow approached Josephine directly on the street outside the Courier and told her with a pleasant smile and the specific menace of a man who has never faced consequences that she might find Red Creek uncomfortable in the long run, and that he knew some very nice families in Santa Fe who might be able to use a correspondent of her skills. She told him she appreciated his concern and returned to her desk and wrote for 2 hours without stopping, which Samuel Reeves, who had witnessed the exchange, described to Quinn as either the bravest or the most determined thing he had ever seen a person do. The third was that Quinn kissed her. This happened on a Thursday evening outside the door of the boarding house, after they had spent 4 hours working on the documentation together. And Josephine had said she was tired, but her eyes were bright, and her voice had that particular undercurrent in it that he had come to recognize over months of paying attention to her. He had walked her to the door, and she had turned on the bottom step, which put them almost exactly at eye level, and the space between them had been the smallest it had ever been, and he had done what he had wanted to do since August. She had kissed him back with the same quality of complete honesty that characterized everything she did, her hands coming up against his chest, and when they separated, she pressed her forehead briefly against his jaw and said nothing for a long moment. "This complicates things," she said finally. "Yes," he agreed. "I don't know that I mind. Neither do I." It did not resolve anything. The note under the door was still real. Harlow was still watching her. The Garrison story was still dangerous and unfinished. But that night, Quinn went back to his office and sat in the dark for a while, and felt something he had almost forgotten was available to him. What he did not know, because Josephine had not told him, was that she had received a second note. This one had come the day after the kiss, slipped into the pages of a document at the Courier, and it did not threaten her vaguely. It named Quinn specifically. It said that Marshal Baxter's position in Red Creek had been maintained by the tacit cooperation of certain interests in the county, and that his protection of a certain correspondent could result in consequences that would affect his ability to serve in that position, and that it would be a shame if a man who was only beginning to find his footing in this community were to lose everything because of an association with someone pursuing a personal grievance. Josephine read that note and understood it completely. She kept it. She did not show it to Quinn. She spent 3 days thinking. The story she was building was real and it was important. The fraud against her father was real. The corruption in the land office was real. But what she had not anticipated, what had not been in her calculations when she arrived in Red Creek in July with her notebook and her careful plans, was Quinn Baxter. She had not anticipated the Tuesday and Thursday coffees, or the creek path walks, or the way he listened with his whole attention, or the fact that, for the first time in her adult life, she had felt genuinely seen by another person in a way that was not contingent on anything she produced or performed. She had not anticipated the kiss, and she had not anticipated how much she wanted everything it suggested. And she had not anticipated that wanting it would put him in danger simply by association with her. The note made one thing clear. Whoever was behind the threats had connections deep enough to reach into the Marshal's professional standing. And if Quinn lost his position because of her, if the work he had made of his life was dismantled because he had chosen to stand near her, that was a cost she was not willing to impose on him without his knowledge and his consent. She had begun to consider telling him. She had almost told him twice. But each time she sat across from him and saw the particular aliveness in his expression when they talked, something that had not been there in his face the first time she met him, and that she recognized as something she had helped put there. She felt the weight of what she was about to take away from him, and could not make herself do it. And then, on a Saturday morning, Herbert Poole had come to her with news. He had received a formal inquiry from a newspaper in Denver, the Rocky Mountain News, about whether she might be available for a staff correspondent position. It was a real opportunity, significant and well-paying, and exactly the kind of thing that opened doors in the profession she was building. He had handed her the letter with his ink-stained fingers and his proud, kind expression, and told her she deserved it. She had read it twice, and set it down and walked to the window and looked out at Main Street, and seen Quinn crossing toward the hotel with his hat brimmed down against the morning sun, and his unhurried, deliberate walk, and she had felt the whole situation land on her at once with the combined weight of every complication. The Garrison story was almost ready to publish. She had what she needed, or close to it. Quinn had the legal documentation proceeding. If she left now, the story could still run. Herbert could carry it forward, and the legal process Quinn had set in motion would continue regardless of her presence, because it was grounded in evidence rather than her proximity. If she stayed, she put him at risk. The note had been explicit about that. If she told him about the note and the risk, he would refuse to let her factor his safety into her decisions, because he was exactly that kind of person, and he would insist on confronting Harlow directly. And that confrontation might escalate into something that got him killed or removed from his position, and she could not be the cause of that. The logic was clear and cold, and it destroyed her. She took a room at the Millfield stage stop, 12 miles out of Red Creek, and booked passage on the Monday morning northbound stage to Santa Fe. She wrote the letter on Sunday evening, 3 pages, careful and honest in the way she tried to be about everything, telling him about the Denver position and the stage and the cousin in Denver, and the life she had to build that was not here. She told him the story was ready to run, and that Herbert had everything he needed. She thanked him for the documentation, and for his thoroughness, and for his integrity. She did not tell him about the second note. She did not tell him it was because of him that she was going. She did not tell him she was in love with him, though she was, completely and irreversibly, in the way that happens when you have shown another person the real shape of your interior life, and they have not looked away. She left the letter at the Marshal's office with Samuel Reeves on Sunday afternoon, with instructions to give it to Quinn when he returned from his evening patrol. She rode out to Millfield before sunset. Quinn had received the letter at 9:30 on Sunday evening, coming in from his patrol cold and tired and finding Samuel on the office steps with an expression that said something had happened. He had read it standing in the doorway with the lamp. He had been in the saddle within 20 minutes. The trail to Millfield was 12 miles of unlit, unpaved road through brush country that Colt knew well enough to navigate by feel, and Quinn had pushed him faster than was strictly safe, because the fear in his chest was specific and articulate now. Not the vague dread of the preceding weeks, but a clear and urgent message from some part of himself that had not experienced this particular emergency before. He had read the letter 8 times, and each reading made less sense, because the Josephine who had written it was not quite the Josephine he knew. She was precise and careful, and she had accounted for everything: the story, the legal process, Herbert, the Denver position, her father's land, all of it accounted for, all of it wrapped up and handed over as though she were filing a final report, and it was exactly that quality that was wrong. Josephine did not wrap things up and hand them over. Josephine stood in the middle of things and worked them until they were finished. She was leaving because she was afraid of something that she had not put in the letter. He was going to find out what it was. The Millfield stage stop was a small operation. A main building with a counter and 2 benches and a back room that functioned as a basic hostelry, run by a broad, taciturn man named Ed Carver and his wife Nora. The building appeared ahead at the end of the trail as a set of lit windows in the darkness, and Quinn slowed Colt to a walk and tried to settle the urgency in his blood into something that would function in a conversation. He tied Colt at the post and went inside. Nora Carver was behind the counter and looked up with the mild surprise of someone who received few visitors at this hour. She took in his badge and his expression and said nothing extra. "I'm looking for a woman named Josephine Vance," Quinn said. "Dark hair, traveling alone. I believe she took a room here tonight." Nora studied him for a moment with the calm assessment of a woman who had seen a great many kinds of men come through her door in the middle of the night looking for women who had left them. "She's here," Nora said. Quinn set his hat on the counter and pressed his hands flat on the surface and said, "Would you tell her that Quinn Baxter is here, and that I'd like to speak with her before she gets on that stage?" Nora looked at him another moment and then went down the short hall to the back room. Quinn waited. He heard voices, Nora's low and neutral, and then a silence, and then a sound that might have been something being set down. Josephine appeared in the doorway of the hall. She was in her traveling clothes, a dark wool jacket and skirt, and her hair was down because it was nearly midnight and she had presumably been readying for sleep. She looked at him across the small room and her expression went through several things in rapid succession, surprise and something raw, and then the careful composure settling back like a door being held partially closed. "You rode here," she said. "I read your letter." "I know." That was the point of writing it. There are things that weren't in the letter. She came further into the room and did not sit down. She stood near the cold fireplace with her arms crossed, not defensively but in the way of someone who needed something to hold on to. "The letter said everything that needed saying," she told him. "No," Quinn said. "It said everything you decided I was allowed to know, which is different." She was quiet. "What are you actually afraid of?" he asked. She looked at him and the composure shifted again and he saw the exhaustion behind it, the weight she had been carrying since whatever had changed. "I'm not afraid," she said. "Josephine." She looked away. "I got a second note," she said. "After the first one." He waited. "It mentioned you specifically. It said your position here, your ability to serve as Marshal, was contingent on the cooperation of certain interests. It said that your association with me was going to cost you everything you've built here." Quinn let the silence hold for a moment. "And you didn't tell me," he said. "Because if I told you, you would do something about it, and doing something about it might get you killed or stripped of your badge, and I was not going to be the reason that happened to you." "That was not your decision to make," he said quietly. "Someone had to make it. You should have made it together with me." She turned back to look at him and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite crying but was the same country. "Quinn, I don't have the right to put you in that position. We've known each other for 3 months. You have a life here, a career, people who depend on you, and someone is threatening all of it because of me. That is not a cost I can ask you to pay." "You're not asking me," he said. "I'm telling you, I know about the threats. I've known Harlow has been escalating for weeks. I have been building a case against him and against Garrison Holdings since September, and it is nearly complete. And none of that has anything to do with what is between you and me, except that both of those things are true simultaneously, and I am capable of managing both." She was watching him. "You were going to leave without telling me any of this," he said. "You were going to get on a stage at dawn and go to Denver, and I was going to read a letter that told me you had a cousin there. I was protecting you. I know that. I know exactly what you were doing and why. And I need you to understand that protecting me by removing yourself from my life is not a protection I want." The words sat in the room between them. "There is a thing happening here," Quinn said, and he did not look away from her. "Between you and me. I'm not a man who has much practice talking about things like this directly. But I am going to be direct about this because you apparently need to hear it stated plainly. I am not willing to let that thing end because someone who is committing fraud and intimidation has decided it threatens his interests. That is not a reasonable price, and I am not paying it." Josephine had unfolded her arms and was watching him with the full, unguarded attention that was her particular quality. "You rode here in the middle of the night," she said softly. "Yes. You read the letter and you didn't wait until morning." "No." "Why not?" He crossed the room toward her and stopped close, not quite touching, and said, "Because I am not built for the kind of patience that lets the person who matters most to you get further away while you sleep." She breathed in once, slow, and the last of the composure came down entirely. "I was going to Denver," she said. "I had it all worked out. I had a plan." "I know you did. It was a thorough plan. It also would have been wrong. You cannot promise me that you won't lose everything because of Harlow's threats." "No," he said, "but I can promise you that I am going to see this through. I have enough on Garrison and Harlow to go to the county sheriff and the territorial authorities both. I have been waiting until the documentation was airtight because I wanted it to be airtight. It is, or very nearly. Whatever Harlow thinks he can threaten me with, he is about to discover that I have been ahead of him for weeks." She was quiet for a long moment. "Quinn," she said. "Yes. I am in love with you." The simplicity of it after everything was the most Josephine thing she had ever done, and he felt it the way you feel a truth that confirms something you already knew but have not heard confirmed before. "I know," he said. "I'm in love with you too." She put her hand on his chest, flat against it the way she had on the boarding house step, and he covered it with his hand, and the cold room with the unlit fireplace and the night pressing against the windows became a place where something was decided. "I'm not getting on that stage," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're not." They rode back to Red Creek in the early morning hours, side by side on the dark trail, Josephine on a horse that Ed Carver agreed to rent her until she could return it in the week, and Quinn close enough that their knees nearly touched. They talked as they rode, the real kind of talking, planning and confessing, and occasionally just being quiet together under the stars. She told him everything about the second note. He told her everything about his investigation, the documents he had collected, the witness statements from former Garrison employees that his source had helped him secure, the letter he had already sent to the territorial marshal's office requesting a meeting. She said, "You've been doing this whole investigation without telling me the full extent of it. I didn't want to worry you until I had enough to act on." She made a sound of amused exasperation. "We are apparently both terrible at sharing bad news. We'll work on that," he said. She looked at him in the dark, and even in the low moonlight he could see her expression, which was something he thought he would not get tired of seeing. "Yes," she said. "I suppose we will." The week that followed was the most consequential in Red Creek's recent history. Quinn met with the territorial marshal, a man named Henry Ash, who had been independently tracking complaints about land fraud in the region, and who received Quinn's documentation with the particular satisfaction of someone whose suspicions have just been thoroughly validated. Henry Ashe was an old hand who had seen this kind of corruption many times. Wealthy landowners using compliant officials in the territorial land office to erase legitimate claims and reassert their own. And the Vance land grant was not the only case in the file he assembled. Denton Harlow was arrested on a Wednesday morning at the Red Creek Hotel by Quinn and two territorial deputies. And he was arrested not only on charges related to fraud and intimidation, but on a separate warrant connected to the illegal pressure he had applied to 3 other individuals in the county who had been looking too closely at Garrison Holdings' land records. Harlow did not go quietly, but he did not go violently either. He went with the particular contained fury of a man who had been outmaneuvered and knew it, and when he looked at Quinn across the hotel lobby, he said something about powerful people and long memories, and Quinn said, "I'm aware. My memory is longer." The principles of Garrison Holdings were a more complex matter. Edward Garrison himself, the patriarch of the operation, was 70 years old and in declining health in a house in Santa Fe, and the direct fraud of the land records had been conducted primarily by his son Morris, who was 38 and considerably less careful than his father had been. Morris Garrison was indicted in November on 6 counts of fraud related to land records manipulation. The case would take time to work through the territorial courts, which was a reality of how justice moved in 1886, but it was moving, and it was real. The land that Josephine's father had been deprived of, 40 acres in the Red Creek River Valley, was not something that could simply be returned to her, because in the intervening years it had been subdivided and developed, and the legal complications were significant. But the county assessed a formal finding that Robert Vance's original land grant deed had been legitimate and that the recorded erasure of his claim had been fraudulent. It was not everything. It was not her father standing in the valley he had planned to work with his hands. But it was the truth stated publicly and on the record, and Josephine wrote about it in the Courier and the Albuquerque Tribune, and submitted the longer piece to the Denver paper that had offered her a position. She did not take the Denver position. She told Herbert Poole that she was staying in Red Creek, and Herbert looked at her over his spectacles and said that he had expected as much since approximately September, and they shook hands on it. Quinn proposed to her on a Saturday morning in early November, in the kitchen of the boarding house, because they had both come down early and Clara had quietly provided coffee and then found somewhere else to be. He did it without speeches. He had thought about speeches and decided they were not his strength and not what Josephine needed. He said that he wanted to spend the rest of his life talking with her and working alongside her and continuing to be the person he was when he was with her, and he asked if she would marry him. She said yes immediately and completely, and without any of the careful hedging she sometimes applied to large decisions, which he understood to mean that she had already thought it through entirely. Clara Aldridge, who was absolutely listening from behind the kitchen door, cried quite a lot, and later described it to Eugenia Marsh as the single most gratifying thing she had witnessed in 40 years of running a boarding house. They were married in December 1886, on a clear cold day when the sky was the particular sharp blue of the New Mexico winter, and the whole of Red Creek turned out with the cheerful intrusiveness of a small town that has been invested in an outcome. Clara Aldridge wore her best dress. Herbert Poole cried, which surprised everyone including himself. Samuel Reeves stood up with Quinn and said afterward that he had never seen the Marshal look like a man who had won something, and he was glad of it. Josephine was married in a dress she and Clara had made together in the 3 weeks preceding, a practical choice in deep blue wool that she thought her mother would have approved of. She carried winter flowers that Nora Carver had brought up from Millfield, And when she walked toward Quinn in the small church on Poplar Street and saw the expression on his face, she felt the distance between July and December as the full measure of everything they had been to each other. They said the words and meant them entirely. The first year of their marriage was full in all the ways that a real life is full. Quinn continued as Marshal of Red Creek County, and his relationship with the territorial authorities was improved by the garrison case into something more collaborative and better resourced, which made his work both more effective and somewhat less lonely than it had been. He was not a man who changed quickly, but Josephine had taught him by example that asking for help was not a deficit, and that sharing the difficult things was not weakness, and he was learning. Josephine's work at the Courier expanded. Herbert, who was 63 and increasingly pleased to have someone he trusted doing the harder field work, gave her more latitude and more space, and her pieces on land rights and territorial justice and the lives of the communities in the county attracted a readership well beyond Red Creek. She was also in correspondence with several newspapers in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and the Rocky Mountain News in Denver ran her work twice, which she felt for a moment would have pleased her father considerably. She missed her father. She spoke about him to Quinn in the evenings, and Quinn listened in the way he had always listened to her, without trying to fix it or diminish it. And sometimes he told her things about the people he had lost, and they held the space of that grief together without rushing it. In August of 1887, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. She told Quinn on a Tuesday morning over coffee in the kitchen of the small house they had moved into in the spring, a proper house this time rather than the boarding house room, on a street 1 block from the creek path, where they still walked sometimes in the evenings. He had gone very still when she told him, and then he had set down his cup and come around the table and held her face in both hands and looked at her with an expression that she kept in her memory for the rest of her life. "Are you pleased?" she asked, though she could see that he was. "I am more than pleased," he said, with the precision of someone choosing words carefully because the available ones were not quite large enough. "I am grateful and terrified and more than pleased," she laughed. "That's honest. I thought we agreed on honesty." "We did," she said, and put her hands over his. Their son was born in the spring of 1888, a boy of substantial opinion and considerable lung capacity, who arrived on a rainy April morning when Quinn had been pacing outside the bedroom door for 6 hours with a composure he absolutely did not feel. The doctor who attended, a methodical woman named Dr. Clara Whitfield, who had come to Red Creek the previous year from Philadelphia, brought the baby out to Quinn while she conferred with her assistant and put him in his arms with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times. Quinn stood in the hallway of their house holding his son and felt the full weight of the world as something worth carrying. They named him Robert, for Josephine's father. Robert Baxter was a child of stubborn curiosity and an early aptitude for finding things that had been put out of his reach, which his parents considered appropriate given his lineage. He walked at 10 months and talked in full sentences at 2 years, usually to announce positions on matters of general household policy that he felt had not been adequately considered. Quinn took him to the office sometimes, where Robert would sit at the deputy's desk and arrange wanted posters with the seriousness of someone doing important administrative work. Samuel Reeves, who had married in 1887 and had a daughter of his own by 1888, became a fixture in Robert's early life, and the two families shared Sunday dinners with the ease of people who have decided they belong to each other. In 1890, Josephine became the first woman to hold a regular editorial position at a New Mexico Territory newspaper, when Herbert Poole officially named her managing editor of the Red Creek Courier. Herbert was 67 by then and increasingly content to manage the books and drink his coffee while Josephine ran the actual paper. And the formal title was, as he described it, simply documentation of what was already true. Quinn had been standing in the back of the office when Herbert made the announcement to the small staff, and Josephine had looked across the room at him with the expression he knew best from her, the one that did not hide anything, and he had felt the pride in his chest as something warm and permanent. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara for the woman who had opened her boarding house to Josephine in July of 1887, and fussed over them both until she was a grandmother in all but name, was born in 1891. Clara Baxter arrived with less drama than her brother, but with no less force of character, and the boarding house Clara Aldridge wept without any embarrassment at all when she held her namesake for the first time. Robert was 3 when his sister arrived, and conducted himself with the generous dignity of a child who has decided that the new situation is probably acceptable after all, which his parents found enormously endearing. The Morris Garrison case worked its way through the territorial courts over several years, as these things did, and in 1891, Morris Garrison was convicted on 4 of the 6 original counts and fined substantially. His land holdings in the county reduced by order of the court to satisfy claims from several defrauded parties, including the Vance estate, which the court awarded to Josephine as the legitimate heir. The 40 acres in the Red Creek River Valley came back into the family legally and formally, and Josephine stood on that land on the day the deed transferred and was quiet for a long time. Quinn stood beside her. "He would have loved it," she said finally, looking out at the river valley in the late afternoon light. The grass was October gold and the river made its constant sound against the rocks. "I think he did love it," Quinn said. "That's why it mattered." She took his hand and held it without speaking. They did not build on the land immediately. For 2 years they left it as it was, visiting sometimes on Sundays, letting Robert run on it and examine the river with his characteristic thoroughness. In 1893, they broke ground on a small structure at the edge of the property, a working space that was partly for the cattle Quinn had been quietly considering and partly for Josephine, who had begun to have ideas about what a family land might mean across generations. Quinn was 40 years old in 1894 and had been Marshal of Red Creek County for 12 years. He was not the same man who had stood in Herbert Poole's office doorway in July of 1886, holding notice posters and forgetting what he was about to say. He was still quiet in company and still built for precision in difficult situations. But the severity had softened at the edges in ways that people in Red Creek had noticed without always being able to name. Samuel Reeves once said that the Marshal laughed more than he used to, and that when he did it was because something was actually funny, and not just because it was socially required. Josephine was 40 by 1900, and still the managing editor of the Courier, and her work had by then been included in a collection of territorial journalism that a university press in the East had published. The letter that arrived from the publisher addressed to Josephine Baxter, formerly Vance, made Quinn drive to the Courier's office in the middle of a workday simply to tell her he was proud of her, which made Herbert Poole, who was still alive and still coming into the office on Monday mornings out of habit, make a sound of deep satisfaction. Robert had grown into a young man who was studying law in Albuquerque, which his parents considered just. Clara, at 9, was already running circles around everyone at the Courier's junior print apprentice position that Josephine had invented partly for educational purposes, and partly because Clara had simply started showing up and making herself useful. One evening in the fall of 1900, with Robert home from Albuquerque for a visit and Clara doing her schoolwork at the kitchen table, and the smell of supper in the air of the house on the street by the creek, Quinn and Josephine sat on the porch in the last of the evening light. It was the kind of quiet that arrives when a life has resolved itself into its true shape, when the emergencies have passed and the grievances have been addressed, and what remains is the real thing that was there all along. "I think about the letter sometimes," Josephine said. Quinn looked over at her. "The goodbye letter. I think about the fact that I sat down at my desk in Clara's boarding house and wrote out 3 pages designed to send you out of my life. And then I rode 12 miles in the dark to argue with you about it," he said. "You were very convincing." "You made it easy," he said. "You had already made up your mind before I got there. You just needed someone to ride through the night and confirm it." She considered this. "That may be true. It is true." She tilted her head at him. "Don't be smug about it." "I'm not being smug. I'm being accurate." She laughed, and he loved the sound of it, the way he had loved it for 14 years, the real laugh that she did not deploy casually. Inside the house, Clara called that supper was going to be cold, which was almost certainly not yet true but which indicated her opinion about timing. Robert's voice answered her with brotherly patience. Quinn and Josephine looked at each other on the porch in the October evening, the whole of Red Creek quiet around them, the creek making its steady sound 2 streets over. "Quinn," she said. "Yes. I'm glad you rode through the night." He reached over and took her hand, and held it the way he had held it on the October land where her father's dream had finally come home. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." They went inside to supper. The house was lit from within, yellow and warm against the October dark, and from a distance, if anyone had been walking the street that evening and looked toward it, it would have looked exactly like what it was. A place where something real had been decided, fought for, built, and kept. The history of Red Creek County was full of stories in those years. The land cases and the court decisions and the slow, imperfect movement of justice through the territory. And many of them passed through the pages of the Courier and the records of the Marshal's office, and were shaped by the hands of 2 people who had found each other in a July that none of the principal parties had anticipated. The Vance land in the river valley grew. By 1902, Quinn had a modest cattle operation running there that was managed on weekdays by a hired hand and on weekends by whoever in the Baxter household was available and willing, which turned out to be everyone. Robert came home from Albuquerque on term breaks and proved, somewhat to his own surprise, that he had his father's steadiness around animals. Clara decided at 11 that horses were her particular interest, and pursued this conviction with the thorough, unstoppable focus that characterized everything she did. Josephine wrote about the land sometimes, about what it meant to hold a piece of territory that had been stolen and reclaimed, about the specific nature of inheritance and loss and recovery. These pieces were some of the best things she wrote, and they were reprinted widely, and people wrote to her about them from places she had never been. Quinn read everything she wrote. He always had. He had read the early Courier pieces back in 1886, with the same attention he brought to her personally, looking for the shape of her mind in the sentences, and the habit had never left him. He kept a file in his desk at the office, clippings of her published work, which Samuel Reeves had discovered once by accident and had absolutely, entirely, with great care never mentioned to another living soul. In 1903, Quinn was offered the position of territorial marshal. It was a significant offer, representing a genuine expansion of authority and responsibility, and a salary that was considerably more than the county position paid. He brought the offer home and set it on the kitchen table, and he and Josephine talked about it over the course of a week. The real talk. The kind where they said the difficult things and the honest things, and considered each other's positions without either of them pretending to certainty they did not have. He turned down the offer. Not because Josephine asked him to or because the complications were insurmountable, but because, after considering it thoroughly, he understood that the work he cared about was local and specific, that the people he served were people he knew, that the particular kind of justice he believed in required the kind of presence that a territorial position could not provide. He was a marshal of a place, not of a category. He told the territorial office his reasons plainly, and they respected them. And he went back to Red Creek and the courier and the house by the creek and the land in the river valley, and he did not regret the decision. What he did, in 1904, was sponsor Samuel Reeves to run for the county sheriff position that had been held for 8 years by a man who was retiring. Samuel was elected without difficulty, being one of the most respected deputies in the region by then, and the celebration that followed was one of the best nights Red Creek had seen in some time, held at the Silver Dollar with considerable proprietary satisfaction from the saloon keeper, who had known all of the principal parties for 2 decades. Robert Baxter became a lawyer in 1905, passed the territorial bar on his first attempt, and established a practice in Albuquerque that within 3 years had become known particularly for land rights cases, which surprised absolutely no one who knew the family. Clara, at 14, was a phenomenon at the courier and at school and on horseback, and her parents watched her with the particular mixture of pride and slight alarm that attends the raising of a person who is entirely themselves from a very early age. The years moved as years do when the life in them is a good one, not without difficulty, because no life is, but with the fundamental solidity of something built on true ground by people who chose each other with full information and have not regretted it. By 1906, Quinn and Josephine had been married for 20 years. They marked it quietly, on a December evening that echoed the December of their wedding by being clear and cold and lit with the sharp blue of a New Mexico winter. They went for a walk along the creek path, the same path they had walked in the evenings of 1886, and the sound of the creek was the same and the stars were the same and they were different, which was right. 20 years, Josephine said. Yes. When I wrote that letter, she said, I thought I was making the responsible choice. I thought I was sparing you something. You were making the choice that made sense with what you knew and felt at the time, he said. You always do. You're being generous. No, he said. I'm being accurate. You know I don't bother with generosity when accuracy will do. She made the sound that was not quite a laugh, the one he loved perhaps most of all her sounds, the involuntary one that happened when he said something that caught her off guard. You rode through the night, she said, 12 miles in the dark. I would do it again tomorrow. I know you would, she said softly. That's who you are. They walked a little further along the path, through the familiar dark of the Red Creek evening, and the town around them was quiet and inhabited and ongoing. The town they had been part of for 20 years. The town where her father's story had finally been told properly, and where his evidence still sat in the territorial record, and where justice had been imperfect, but had not been entirely absent. Quinn, she said. Yes. Whatever comes next, she said, I want you to know that this, exactly this, has been the life I would have chosen if someone had told me in 1886 what the choices were. He stopped walking and turned to look at her, and she was looking at him in the way she had looked at him in the Millfield stage stop in the middle of the night 14 years ago, with the last of the guards down and everything visible. That is true for me as well, he said. Exactly that. They stood in the dark by the creek that had given the town its name and held each other's hands, and the night settled around them, complete and undemanding, and the town held them inside it like something it was keeping safe. When they walked back home, the lights of the house were on because Clara had gotten there before them and had opinions about supper timing, and through the windows, the interior was warm and inhabited and real. Quinn Baxter held the door for his wife, and Josephine Vance Baxter walked through it, and the door closed behind them both. The letter was in his desk at the Marshal's office still, in the file he kept with her clippings, 3 pages of careful slanted writing that had sent him onto a horse in the dark of an October night in 1886. He had kept it without entirely knowing why, except that it was the document that had made him understand what he was unwilling to lose, and that kind of document deserved keeping. Josephine knew it was there. She had seen it once years ago and had looked at him with something in her expression that was not embarrassment but was close to wonder. "You kept it," she said. "Yes." Why? He had considered the question seriously, which was the only way he considered any question. "Because it was the moment I understood what I wanted," he said. It seemed worth remembering. She had picked it up and read it once, all 3 pages, the version of herself from 1886, who had been trying to do the responsible thing and had not yet understood what responsible things cost. She had folded it carefully and put it back in the file. "I'm glad you rode," she said. "I'm glad you were still there when I arrived," he said. The October of 1886 was the last time Josephine Vance tried to write herself out of the story she was supposed to be in. Quinn Baxter made sure of that, one night ride at a time.